Marcus Thompson sat in the sterile waiting room of the Veterans Affairs office, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across his face that told the story of 23 years of military service. He had been waiting for 40 minutes now, watching the clock on the wall tick away precious seconds of his life while his disability claim sat somewhere in the maze of bureaucracy that had become his new battlefield. The plastic chair beneath him was uncomfortable, designed more for efficiency than compassion. Around him, other veterans waited with the same mixture of hope and resignation that had become all too familiar. Some stared at their phones, others at the floor, and a few gazed out the window at a world that seemed to have moved on without them. Marcus knew that look well. He wore it himself most days. His left leg throbbed with the familiar ache that had been his constant companion since that day in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The improvised explosive device had changed everything in a split second. One moment he was leading his squad through a routine patrol, the next he was lying in a field hospital wondering if he would ever walk normally again. The doctors had done their best, inserting titanium rods and pins to hold his shattered femur together, but some things could never be fully repaired. The injury had ended his military career abruptly. After more than 2 decades of serving his country, Marcus found himself suddenly, civilian, struggling to navigate a world that seemed foreign despite being his homeland. The transition was harder than any mission he had ever undertaken. At least in the military, he knew his purpose, knew his place in the grand scheme of things. Here, he felt lost and forgotten. His wife Sarah had been patient, more patient than he deserved. She watched him struggle with depression and anger, witnessed his failed attempts to find meaningful employment, and held him during the nightmares that came with increasing frequency. Their savings had dwindled as medical bills mounted and his job applications were met with polite rejections. The disability claim was their last hope for financial stability. Marcus glanced at his watch again. 45 minutes now. He had taken time off from his part-time job at the hardware store for this appointment, time he could not afford to lose. The job paid barely above minimum wage and offered no benefits, but it was all he could find that accommodated his physical limitations. His supervisor had not been happy about the absence, making pointed comments about reliability and commitment. The irony was not lost on Marcus, who had spent over 2 decades proving his reliability and commitment to something far greater than hardware sales. The woman at the reception desk avoided eye contact, her fingers clicking away at her keyboard with mechanical precision. Marcus had tried asking her about the delay 20 minutes ago, only to be told that his caseworker was running behind and would see him soon. Soon had become an abstract concept in this place where time seemed to move differently, where urgent need met institutional indifference. Behind him, an older veteran began coughing violently, the harsh sound echoing off the sterile walls. Agent Orange, Marcus thought grimly. Another casualty of service, another man fighting a different kind of war against his own government for recognition and care. The coughing continued until the man excused himself to the restroom, leaving behind only the sound of the buzzing lights and the distant clacking of keyboards. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to push away the growing frustration. He thought about his squad, the men he had led and protected for so many years. They had trusted him completely, and he had never let them down. Not once. He wondered what they would think if they could see him now, reduced to begging for help from bureaucrats who seemed more concerned with processing paperwork than caring for the people who had sacrificed everything for their country. The memories came unbidden, as they often did. The weight of his gear on patrol, the sound of helicopters overhead, the way his men looked to him for guidance in the most dangerous situations imaginable. He had been good at his job, respected by his superiors and loved by his subordinates. Command had come naturally to him, and he had risen through the ranks with steady determination and unwavering integrity. Staff Sergeant Thompson, they had called him. The title had meant something. It represented years of hard work, countless hours of training, and the respect of his peers. Now he was just Marcus, another broken veteran waiting in line for help that might never come. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How is it going?" she asked. He stared at the simple question, unsure how to answer. How could he explain that he felt smaller with each passing minute in this place? How could he tell her that his pride was being systematically dismantled by institutional neglect? He typed back, still waiting, and put the phone away. The woman at the desk finally looked up and called a name. Not his name. Another veteran rose slowly and walked toward the back offices, his movements careful and measured. Marcus watched him disappear down the hallway and felt his own hope dim a little more. The process continued, one by one, as people who had arrived after him were called before him. He began to wonder if his file had been lost, if he had been forgotten entirely. The physical pain in his leg was nothing compared to the emotional toll of sitting in that chair, feeling invisible and unimportant. This was not how he had imagined his relationship with his country would end. He had given everything, asked for nothing but the opportunity to serve, and now he was reduced to this undignified waiting game. A young soldier in uniform walked through the waiting room, and Marcus felt a pang of envy mixed with protective concern. The kid looked fresh out of basic training, his uniform crisp and his eyes bright with purpose. Marcus wanted to warn him somehow, to tell him to enjoy these early days when everything seemed clear and meaningful. But what would he say? That service was meaningless? That sacrifice went unrecognized? He could not bring himself to poison the young man's idealism, even if his own had been thoroughly destroyed. The clock showed 50 minutes now. Marcus shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that did not aggravate his injury. The waiting room had emptied and filled again since he arrived, a steady stream of veterans seeking help, recognition, or simply acknowledgement that their service mattered. Some left with satisfied expressions, others with the same defeated look they had worn coming in. He thought about the Purple Heart sitting in a drawer at home, wrapped in tissue paper like some forgotten relic. The medal had once meant everything to him, a symbol of his sacrifice and dedication. Now it felt like a cruel joke, a participation trophy for getting blown up in service of a country that seemed eager to forget him. The receptionist's voice cut through his thoughts. "Mr. Thompson," she called, finally, after nearly an hour of waiting. He stood carefully, his leg protesting the sudden movement, and walked toward her desk. She did not look up as she spoke. "I'm sorry, but your caseworker has been called away on urgent business. We'll need to reschedule your appointment." The words hit him like a physical blow. An hour of his life, an hour of hope and anxiety and growing desperation, dismissed with casual indifference. He stood there for a moment, processing the absurdity of it all. 23 years of service, reduced to a rescheduled appointment with someone too busy to see him. "When?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside him. "I'll have to check his calendar and call you," she replied, still not meeting his eyes. "It might be a few weeks." A few weeks. He thought about Sarah at home, probably checking her phone for updates. He thought about the bills piling up on their kitchen table, the medications he needed but could not always afford, the future that seemed to grow dimmer with each passing day. A few weeks might as well be forever. Marcus nodded slowly and turned to leave, his dignity intact despite everything. He had learned long ago that showing emotion in these situations only made things worse. The system did not respond to passion or desperation, it responded to patience and persistence, qualities he had in abundance but was rapidly losing. As he walked toward the exit, he passed the young soldier again. The kid was studying a bulletin board covered with information about benefits and programs, his face serious and determined. Marcus almost stopped to speak with him, to offer some words of encouragement or warning. Instead, he continued walking, unwilling to be the one to shatter another person's faith in the system. The parking lot was nearly empty when he reached his car, an aging sedan that had seen better days. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine, trying to decide what to tell Sarah. The truth seemed too harsh, too final. But lies had never been part of their relationship, and he would not start now. The drive home took him through neighborhoods where he had once felt he belonged, past flags and yellow ribbon magnets that proclaimed support for the troops. The symbols felt hollow now, empty gestures that cost nothing and changed nothing. Real support, he had learned, was measured not in displays of patriotism but in the treatment of those who had actually served. He thought about his former life, the sense of purpose and camaraderie that had defined his existence for so many years. The military had been more than a job, it had been an identity, a calling that gave meaning to every day. Without it, he felt adrift in a world that valued different things, a world where profit mattered more than service and convenience mattered more than sacrifice. The house came into view, modest but well-maintained, a symbol of the life he and Sarah had built together. She would be waiting for news, hoping that today would mark a turning point in their struggle. He hated disappointing her, hated being the source of stress and worry in her life. She had married a confident leader, a man who could handle any challenge. Instead, she had gotten a broken veteran who could not even navigate a simple appointment. As he pulled into the driveway, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would not give up. He would not let the system's indifference defeat him. He had survived combat, recovered from devastating injuries, and rebuilt his life once before. He could do it again. But, as he sat there in his car, preparing to face his wife's hopeful expression with news of another delay, he wondered how many more defeats he could absorb before something fundamental inside him broke completely. The waiting had taught him nothing except that his time, his dignity, and his service apparently meant very little to those in power. But tomorrow was another day, and he would find another way to fight. The war was far from over, even if the battlefield had changed beyond recognition. 3 weeks had passed since the failed appointment, and Marcus found himself back in the same waiting room, sitting in what seemed to be the exact same plastic chair. The irony was not lost on him that he had arrived early this time, determined not to give them any excuse to dismiss him again. The receptionist was different today, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who had actually smiled when he checked in. The waiting room buzzed with quiet conversation and the rustle of paperwork. Marcus had brought a book this time, though he found it impossible to concentrate on the words. His mind kept wandering to the conversation he had had with Sarah the night before. She had tried to hide her worry, but he could see the stress lines around her eyes deepening with each passing day. Their savings were nearly gone, and the part-time job at the hardware store barely covered the utilities. Yesterday had been particularly difficult. He had applied for a position as a security supervisor at a local company, a job that seemed perfect for someone with his background. The interview had gone well until they asked about his medical limitations. The moment he mentioned his leg injury and the ongoing therapy, their enthusiasm had visibly cooled. They promised to be in touch, but Marcus knew he would never hear from them again. The rejection had hit harder than usual because the job would have solved so many of their problems. Good pay, health insurance, and work that felt meaningful again. Instead, he was back to scanning job boards for positions that required no experience, no skills, and offered no future. It was a humbling experience for someone who had once been responsible for million-dollar equipment and the lives of dozens of soldiers. A veteran sitting across from him caught his attention. The man was younger, probably early 30s, but he moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older. His right arm hung at an awkward angle, and Marcus recognized the telltale signs of nerve damage. They nodded at each other in silent acknowledgement, members of a club nobody wanted to join. First time, the younger man asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. You? Third, the man replied with a bitter laugh. Same claim, different year. They keep asking for more documentation, more proof that my arm doesn't work the way it used to. As if I'm making it up for fun. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another veteran, this one clearly struggling with invisible wounds. Marcus had learned to recognize the signs over the years. The hypervigilance, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, the careful positioning near the exit. Combat stress, they called it now, though Marcus still thought of it by its old name. Whatever they called it, the pain was real and the treatment was inadequate. Marcus thought about his own invisible wounds, the ones that did not show up on X-rays or medical reports. The nightmares that came without warning, the way certain sounds could transport him instantly back to that dusty road in Afghanistan. The depression that settled over him like a thick fog, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Those injuries were harder to document, harder to prove, and often harder to treat. His phone buzzed with a message from his old squad leader, Tony Martinez. Tony had managed to transition successfully to civilian life, landing a good job with a defense contractor and maintaining the kind of stability that Marcus envied. The message was simple:
thinking of you, brother. Let me know if you need anything.
The offer was genuine, Marcus knew, but pride prevented him from accepting help from his former subordinates.
Tony had enough challenges without taking on Marcus's problems too. Besides, what could he really do?
The system was broken, and no amount of friendship or goodwill could fix the fundamental issues that plagued veteran services. A door opened somewhere down the hallway, and Marcus heard his name called.
Finally.
He stood carefully, gathering his paperwork and the thick folder of medical documents he had assembled over the past 3 years. The walk down the hallway felt longer than usual, each step a reminder of how much his life had changed since that day in Afghanistan. The caseworker's office was small and cramped, dominated by filing cabinets and stacks of folders that seemed to reach toward the ceiling. Behind the desk sat a thin woman in her 50s, her hair pulled back severely and her expression professional but not unkind. She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk. "Mr. Thompson," she began, consulting the file in front of her.
"I've reviewed your claim, and I have some questions about the documentation you've provided."
Marcus felt his heart sink. More questions meant more delays, more hoops to jump through, more opportunities for his claim to get lost in the bureaucratic maze. He had already provided everything they had asked for: medical records, service records, statements from witnesses to his injury. What more could they possibly need?
The next hour was a painful exercise in bureaucratic precision.
Every detail of his injury was dissected and analyzed, as if the caseworker was searching for inconsistencies that would allow her to deny his claim. Marcus found himself defending his own pain, explaining why he could not perform certain tasks, justifying his need for help from the very people who were supposed to provide it.
The questions became increasingly personal and invasive. How many hours could he work without pain? What medications was he taking? How did his injury affect his marriage?
Each question felt like a violation, a reduction of his complex reality to simple boxes that could be checked or left empty. When the interrogation finally ended, the caseworker leaned back in her chair and delivered the verdict with practiced neutrality. His claim was being placed under additional review, which meant more delays and more uncertainty. She could not give him a timeline for resolution, but assured him that they would contact him if they needed additional information. Marcus walked out of the office feeling smaller than when he had entered. The entire process had been designed to wear him down, to make him question whether the help was worth the humiliation. He wondered how many veterans simply gave up, accepting defeat rather than continuing to fight a system that seemed determined to exhaust them into submission. The parking lot was busy with afternoon traffic, and Marcus sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. He thought about the young soldier he had seen weeks earlier, the one with bright eyes and crisp uniforms. Marcus hoped that kid would never find himself in this situation, but statistics suggested otherwise. Too many veterans ended up here eventually, broken by service and forgotten by the country they had served. The drive home took him past the local high school, where he could see teenagers playing football on the practice field. Their energy and optimism reminded him of his younger self, the 18-year-old who had enlisted with dreams of making a difference in the world. That young man would never have imagined ending up here, begging for help from people who seemed more interested in protecting the system than serving the veterans.
At home, Sarah was waiting with dinner and gentle questions about his appointment.
Marcus found himself editing the truth, focusing on the process rather than the outcome. She deserved better than a husband who could not even navigate the benefits system successfully, but her love remained constant despite his failures. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his small home office and spread his paperwork across the desk. Somewhere in this maze of documents and regulations was the key to getting the help he needed. He had approached military problems with systematic determination for over 2 decades. Surely he could apply the same methodology to this challenge. The computer screen glowed as he researched appeals processes and veterans' rights organizations. Online forums were filled with similar stories of bureaucratic nightmares and successful appeals. Some veterans had waited years for resolution, while others had found advocates who helped them navigate the system more effectively. One story particularly caught his attention. A former Marine had been denied benefits multiple times before connecting with a veterans service organization that provided free legal assistance. With their help, he had successfully appealed his case and received not only his benefits but also back pay for the years he had waited. The story offered hope, but also highlighted the fundamental injustice of a system that required legal intervention to provide basic care. Marcus bookmarked several websites and made notes about organizations he could contact. Tomorrow he would begin making phone calls, reaching out to anyone who might be able to help him navigate the bureaucratic maze. He had survived worse challenges than this, he could survive the benefits process too. But, as he prepared for bed, Marcus felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a physical force.
How many more appointments would he endure? How many more hoops would he jump through? How long could Sarah maintain her optimism in the face of endless delays and disappointments?
The questions followed him into sleep, mixing with dreams of dusty roads and exploding devices and waiting rooms that stretched on forever. In his dreams, he was always waiting, always hoping for someone to call his name and, finally, provide the help he needed. But the dreams, like his appointments, never seemed to end with satisfaction, only with the promise that someday, if he was patient enough, if he was persistent enough, if he was lucky enough, someone might actually care enough to help.
The next morning brought new determination and new plans. Marcus would not be defeated by paperwork and bureaucracy.
He had faced down armed insurgents and improvised explosive devices. Surely he could handle a few caseworkers and their endless questions. The war continued, but he was far from ready to surrender. His service had meant something, his sacrifice had value, and he would not let anyone convince him otherwise. The fight was just beginning, and Marcus Thompson was nothing if not a fighter. 6 months had passed since Marcus began his battle with the Veterans Benefits System, and the toll was becoming impossible to hide. Sarah had started working double shifts at the nursing home where she was employed, her hands cracked and raw from constant hand washing and sanitizing. The extra money helped, but it meant Marcus spent most evenings alone with his thoughts and his growing collection of rejection letters. The hardware store job had ended abruptly when his supervisor decided that Marcus's medical appointments were too disruptive to the work schedule. The irony of being fired for seeking treatment for service-related injuries was not lost on him, but legal recourse seemed as distant and complicated as his disability claim. He had found another part-time position cleaning offices at night, work that paid even less but allowed him to avoid the judgmental stares of customers who wondered why a relatively young man walked with such obvious difficulty.
The night shift suited his insomnia anyway. Sleep had become increasingly elusive as financial stress compounded his existing trauma. Marcus would lie awake for hours, calculating and recalculating their monthly expenses, trying to find money that simply was not there. Their credit cards were maxed out, and they had already borrowed against Sarah's retirement account. The house, their one significant asset, was now being considered for a reverse mortgage despite their young age. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Marcus had an appointment with a veterans service organization that specialized in helping with disability claims. The appointment was at 7 in the evening, after the regular business day ended, in a small office above a pizza restaurant downtown. Marcus had found them through one of the online forums, recommended by a veteran who had successfully appealed his case after 3 years of fighting. The office was cramped but warm, decorated with military memorabilia and photographs of smiling veterans who had presumably found success through their services. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man who introduced himself as Robert Chen, a former Army officer who had left active duty to dedicate himself to helping other veterans navigate the benefits system. Robert was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in his early 40s, but his eyes held the weight of experience. His own service had ended after an injury in Iraq, and he spoke with the authority of someone who had walked the same difficult path that Marcus was now traveling. "I've reviewed your file," Robert began, spreading Marcus's paperwork across his desk. "You have a strong case, but you're fighting an uphill battle because of how you've presented your information. The system is designed to find reasons to deny claims, not approve them. We need to reorganize your approach." For the next 2 hours, Robert dissected every aspect of Marcus's claim, explaining the bureaucratic language and hidden requirements that had been sabotaging his efforts. The injury was well documented, but the connection between his current limitations and his service had not been clearly established in terms the system could recognize. Medical reports needed to be reorganized,
witness statements required specific language, and his own descriptions of his limitations needed to be more precise and comprehensive. Most importantly, Robert explained, Marcus needed to document not just his physical limitations but also the impact on his daily life. The system wanted to know exactly how many hours he could work, what tasks were impossible, and how his injury affected his ability to earn a living. It was a dehumanizing process, but Robert had learned to speak their language fluently. The hardest part, Robert said, is that you have to become your own worst enemy. You have to focus on everything you can't do anymore, all the ways your injury has diminished your life. It goes against every instinct we developed in the military, where we were trained to overcome obstacles and push through pain.
Marcus understood immediately.
For over 2 decades, he had been conditioned to minimize problems, to find solutions, to never admit weakness or defeat. Now the system demanded that he catalog his every limitation and weakness in exhaustive detail. It felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught about military bearing and mental toughness. Robert helped him complete new forms, asking questions that forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about his limitations.
How many blocks could he walk before the pain became unbearable? How often did he need to elevate his leg during the day? How did the medication affect his concentration and memory? Each question chipped away at the self-image Marcus had been desperately trying to maintain.
The most difficult part was documenting the psychological impact of his injury. Marcus had always prided himself on his mental resilience, his ability to compartmentalize trauma and maintain focus under pressure. Admitting that he struggled with depression and anxiety felt like acknowledging fundamental weakness, even though he knew intellectually that such reactions were normal and common among injured veterans. Robert was patient but persistent, helping Marcus understand that honesty about his struggles was not a sign of failure but a requirement for getting the help he needed. The system would not reward stoicism or military bearing, it responded only to detailed documentation of genuine need. By the end of the session, Marcus felt simultaneously hopeful and defeated. Hopeful because Robert had given him a clear path forward and had volunteered to represent him throughout the appeals process. Defeated because the path required him to abandon his dignity and present himself as fundamentally broken in ways that went far beyond his physical injury.
How long? Marcus asked as they prepared to leave.
If we do this right, 6 to 12 months for the appeal, Robert replied.
Maybe longer if they request additional examinations or documentation. I won't lie to you, Marcus. It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint.
But I've seen cases like yours succeed, and I believe in what we're doing. The drive home took Marcus through neighborhoods that had once felt familiar and welcoming. Now he noticed things differently: the veteran license plates on cars and driveways, the yellow ribbon magnets that proclaimed support for the troops, the American flags flying in front yards. All of these symbols of patriotic sentiment felt hollow when contrasted with his own experience of seeking help from his country. At home, Sarah was waiting with dinner and gentle questions about his meeting. Marcus found himself sharing more details than usual, perhaps because Robert's approach had given him hope for the first time in months. Sarah listened carefully, asking practical questions about timelines and requirements, but Marcus could see the relief in her eyes at the possibility that their struggle might finally have an endpoint. After dinner, they sat together on the couch reviewing the new paperwork Robert had prepared. The forms were more comprehensive than anything Marcus had completed before, documenting not just his injury but its impact on every aspect of his life. Reading through the detailed catalog of his limitations was painful but also strangely liberating. For the first time, someone had helped him articulate the full scope of his losses in terms the system might understand. Sarah helped him practice describing his pain levels and functional limitations, role-playing the questions he might face during his independent medical examination. It was difficult for both of them to focus on his weaknesses rather than his strengths, but they had learned that the system required a different kind of honesty than they were accustomed to providing. Late that night, as Sarah slept beside him, Marcus found himself thinking about his former life and the person he used to be. Staff Sergeant Thompson had been a leader, a problem solver, someone others looked to for guidance and strength. That person felt like a stranger now, replaced by someone who needed help with basic life functions and struggled to maintain his dignity while begging for assistance.
But perhaps that was the real challenge of military transition, he thought. Learning to be vulnerable when you had been trained to be invulnerable. Learning to accept help when you had been conditioned to provide it. Learning to be human again after years of being something more and less than human. The next few weeks passed in a blur of additional appointments and examinations. Robert had arranged for Marcus to see specialists who would provide the specific documentation the appeals board required. Each appointment was another opportunity to catalog his limitations, another chance to prove that his injury was real and significant. The independent medical examination was particularly challenging. The doctor was polite but skeptical, asking Marcus to perform a series of physical tasks while carefully documenting his limitations. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of trying to demonstrate his disability convincingly, walking and bending and lifting while hoping that his pain would be obvious enough to satisfy the examiner. The psychological evaluation was even more difficult. Marcus had never spoken to a mental health professional about his combat experiences or the depression that had followed his injury. The psychologist was skilled at drawing out information, but every revelation felt like an admission of weakness that went against decades of military conditioning. Through it all, Robert remained a steady source of guidance and advocacy. He had seen it all before and understood both the bureaucratic requirements and the personal cost of meeting them. His experience navigating the system had taught him to be simultaneously compassionate toward veterans and ruthless in his advocacy on their behalf. As they waited for the appeals board to schedule Marcus's hearing, Robert prepared him for what to expect. The board would consist of 3 people, a medical professional, a legal expert, and a veterans advocate. They would review all of his documentation and ask him to explain his injury and its impact on his life. The hearing would be formal but not adversarial, and Marcus would have the opportunity to present his case in person. Remember, Robert told him during one of their preparation sessions, this is not about military bearing or showing strength. This is about demonstrating need and establishing the connection between your service and your current limitations. Be honest, be detailed, and don't minimize your pain. The advice went against every instinct Marcus had developed over his military career, but he had learned to trust Robert's expertise. The man had successfully guided dozens of veterans through this process, and his track record spoke for itself. If submitting to this bureaucratic humiliation was the price of getting the help he needed, Marcus was prepared to pay it. As the date for his hearing approached, Marcus found himself oscillating between hope and despair. Hope that this might finally be the end of his struggle with the system. Despair that even success would come at the cost of his dignity and self-respect. But Sarah's unwavering support and Robert's patient advocacy reminded him that he was not fighting this battle alone. The war was far from over, but at least now he had allies who understood both the enemy and the terrain. Whatever happened next, Marcus would face it with the same determination that had carried him through 2 decades of military service. The battlefield had changed, but his commitment to victory remained unshakable. The day of Marcus's appeals hearing arrived with unseasonable rain that turned the October morning gray and somber. He had been awake since 4, reviewing his testimony notes and trying to calm his nerves with the breathing exercises the VA psychologist had taught him. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but Robert had insisted they arrive early to review their strategy one final time. The federal building where the hearing would take place was an imposing structure of glass and steel that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Security was tight, and Marcus had to remove his belt and shoes, a process that aggravated his leg injury and reminded him uncomfortably of his vulnerability. Robert guided him through the maze of hallways to a small conference room on the 4th floor, where they would wait until called. The room was sterile and windowless, furnished only with a rectangular table and several uncomfortable chairs. Robert spread Marcus's paperwork across the table one final time, organizing the medical records and witness statements that would form the foundation of his appeal. The thick folder represented 3 years of doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and psychological evaluations, all reduced to clinical language that barely captured the reality of his daily struggle. "Remember what we practiced," Robert said quietly. "Be specific about your limitations. Don't minimize your pain or try to appear stronger than you are. The board needs to understand exactly how this injury has changed your life. Marcus nodded, though every instinct rebelled against the strategy.
23 years of military service had conditioned him to project strength even in weakness, to find solutions rather than dwell on problems. Now he was being asked to do the opposite, to present himself as fundamentally diminished and in need of help. The role reversal felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught about military bearing.
At precisely 10 o'clock, a clerk appeared to escort them to the hearing room. The walk down the hallway seemed endless, each step bringing Marcus closer to a moment that could determine his family's financial future.
His leg throbbed with each footfall, a constant reminder of the injury that had upended his life and brought him to this bureaucratic crossroads. The hearing room was larger than Marcus had expected, dominated by a raised platform where 3 officials sat behind an imposing desk. To the left was Dr. Patricia Williams, a medical review officer whose stern expression suggested little patience for exaggeration or self-pity. In the center sat Judge Michael Rodriguez, a veteran himself who had transitioned to the appeals board after a career in military law.
On the right was Linda Foster, a veterans advocate whose role was theoretically to ensure fair treatment of claimants.
Below the platform, Marcus and Robert took their seats at a small table facing the board. The formal atmosphere was reminiscent of a court-martial, though the stakes were different. Instead of facing punishment, Marcus was fighting for recognition of his sacrifice and access to the benefits he had earned through his service. Judge Rodriguez called the hearing to order and outlined the process they would follow. Marcus would present his case, the board would ask questions, and they would render a decision based on the evidence presented. The judge's tone was professional but not unkind, suggesting that he understood the difficulty of the situation for everyone involved. Robert began by presenting an overview of Marcus's military service and the circumstances of his injury. His voice was confident and well-modulated, laying out the facts in clear, bureaucratic language that the board could easily understand. The improvised explosive device, the extensive surgery, the ongoing limitations, all of it was presented as a logical chain of causation that led inevitably to Marcus's current need for disability benefits. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he felt his mouth go dry despite his preparation. The 3 officials stared down at him with professional interest, waiting for him to justify his need for help. He began with his service record, summarizing 2 decades of deployments and commendations and leadership positions. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about his military achievements, the familiar territory of his professional accomplishments providing a foundation of confidence. But, then, came the difficult part. Dr. Williams asked him to describe his current physical limitations in detail, and Marcus found himself cataloging the ways his injury had diminished his capabilities. He could no longer run or march long distances. Standing for extended periods caused severe pain. His sleep was frequently disrupted by discomfort and the need to change positions. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or yard work required careful planning and frequent rest breaks. The questions became increasingly personal and invasive. How many hours could he work without significant pain? What medications was he taking, and how did they affect his cognitive function? How had his injury impacted his relationship with his wife? Each question chipped away at his privacy and dignity, reducing his complex reality to simple metrics that could be easily quantified and evaluated. Judge Rodriguez asked about his employment history since leaving the military, and Marcus had to admit the painful truth about his failed job searches and terminations. Each rejection had been another blow to his self-esteem, another reminder that his skills and experience were less valuable in the civilian world than he had hoped. The pattern of brief employment followed by dismissal painted a picture of unemployability that Marcus hated but could not deny. Linda Foster, the veterans advocate, asked gentler questions about his daily routine and coping strategies. Marcus appreciated her attempt to humanize the process, but even her sympathetic inquiry forced him to acknowledge the numerous accommodations he had made to manage his limitations. His life had become a series of workarounds and compromises, a constant negotiation between his body's capabilities and his desire to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The most difficult moment came when Dr. Williams questioned the severity of his psychological symptoms. She had reviewed the reports from his mental health evaluations, but she wanted to hear directly from Marcus about his depression and anxiety. The clinical language of the reports had sanitized his experience, making his suffering sound manageable and routine. Marcus struggled to find words for experiences that defied easy description.
How could he explain the way certain sounds transported him instantly back to Afghanistan?
How could he make them understand the weight of survivor's guilt, the constant questioning of why he had lived when others had died? How could he articulate the way his identity had disintegrated along with his leg, leaving him uncertain of who he was or what he was worth? Robert intervened when Marcus's voice began to break, redirecting the board's attention to the medical documentation and expert opinions that supported his claim. The intervention was skillful and necessary, but it also reminded Marcus of how far he had fallen from the confident leader he had once been. The hearing continued for nearly 3 hours, with each board member asking detailed questions about different aspects of his case. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, though every admission of weakness felt like a betrayal of his military training. He was no longer Staff Sergeant Thompson, the competent leader who could handle any challenge. He was just Marcus, a broken veteran seeking help from a system that seemed designed to test his desperation rather than provide relief. When the questions finally ended, Judge Rodriguez explained that the board would review all the evidence and render a decision within 60 days. The official language was neutral and procedural, offering no hint of which way the decision might go. Marcus and Robert were thanked for their time and dismissed, leaving the building with no more certainty than they had arrived with. The walk to the parking lot was conducted in relative silence, both men processing what had just occurred. Robert seemed cautiously optimistic about their presentation, but he had learned not to make promises about outcomes he could not control. The appeals board was unpredictable, and even strong cases could be denied for reasons that defied logic or compassion. In the car, Marcus felt emotionally drained and physically exhausted. The hearing had required him to relive the worst moments of his injury and recovery while simultaneously defending the legitimacy of his ongoing struggles. The process was designed to be thorough, but it felt more like an extended humiliation than a fair evaluation of his needs. Sarah was waiting at home with lunch and gentle questions about how the hearing had gone. Marcus found himself struggling to summarize the experience, partly because it was still too fresh and partly because he was not sure what it all meant. He had done his best to present his case honestly and completely, but the outcome remained entirely beyond his control. That evening, Marcus and Sarah sat together on their back porch, watching the rain continue to fall on their small garden. They had planted vegetables that spring, hopeful that a successful harvest might reduce their grocery bills during the difficult months ahead. The rain was good for the plants, but it also reminded them of how many things remained outside their influence.
"Do you think it went well?" Sarah asked eventually. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think we did everything we could," he said finally. "Robert was right about being honest, even when it was hard. Whether that's enough, I don't know. The uncertainty was almost harder than outright rejection would have been.
At least denial would have provided closure and a clear path forward, even if that path led to another appeal or a different strategy. The waiting period ahead would be filled with second-guessing and anxiety, punctuated by the arrival of mail that might contain life-changing news. Over the following weeks, Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Every phone call from an unknown number made his heart race. Every piece of mail from a government office required careful examination. The 60-day timeline felt simultaneously too long and too short, too much time to spend worrying and not enough time to prepare for either outcome. Robert checked in regularly, offering updates on other cases and reassurance about the strength of Marcus's presentation. His confidence was comforting but not conclusive, and Marcus had learned not to invest too much hope in positive speculation. The system was too unpredictable, too influenced by factors beyond logic or fairness. Meanwhile, their financial situation continued to deteriorate. The night cleaning job provided some income, but it was not enough to cover their basic expenses without the assistance they hoped would come from Marcus's disability benefits. Sarah had picked up additional shifts whenever possible, but there were limits to how much extra work her body could handle. Marcus found himself thinking often about his former squad members, wondering how many of them had faced similar challenges in transitioning to civilian life. Tony Martinez called occasionally with updates about his own successful career, but Marcus could hear the carefully edited optimism in his friend's voice. Tony knew about the struggles but maintained the polite fiction that everything would work out eventually. As the end of the 60-day period approached, Marcus felt his anxiety intensifying. The decision could arrive any day, and he found himself checking the mail multiple times daily and jumping every time his phone rang. Sarah tried to distract him with routine activities and positive conversation, but they both understood that their future hung in the balance of bureaucratic deliberation. The waiting had become its own form of torture, a prolonged uncertainty that made it impossible to plan or hope with any confidence. Marcus had survived combat and recovered from devastating injury, but the appeals process had tested him in ways that physical challenges never could. The systematic dismantling of his dignity and self-reliance had left him questioning not just his worth to society but his fundamental identity as a person. Still, he endured. Not because he was particularly strong or brave, but because he had no other choice. Sarah needed him to fight, their future depended on his persistence, and somewhere deep inside the broken veteran was the stubborn core of the soldier who had never learned to surrender. Whatever decision arrived in their mailbox, Marcus would face it with the same determination that had carried him through every other challenge in his life. The war continued, but so did the warrior. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 57 days after the hearing. Marcus recognized the official envelope immediately, his name and address printed in the sterile font of government correspondence. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it inside, where Sarah waited with a mixture of hope and dread that had become their constant companion over the past 2 months. They sat together at the kitchen table, the unopened envelope between them like an unexploded device. Inside those pages was either validation of their 3-year struggle or another crushing disappointment that would send them back to the beginning of the appeals process. Marcus had rehearsed this moment countless times, trying to prepare himself for either outcome, but now that it had arrived, he felt paralyzed by the weight of possibility. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Whatever it says, we'll deal with it together," she said quietly. Marcus nodded and carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the official letter with hands that refused to remain steady. The bureaucratic language was dense and formal, full of references to regulations and procedures that meant little to someone not versed in the intricacies of federal benefits law. But, buried in the second paragraph, Marcus found the words that changed everything: "Your appeal has been approved." The relief was so overwhelming that Marcus felt his vision blur with tears he had been holding back for months. Sarah leaned forward to read over his shoulder, and her gasp of joy confirmed that he had not misunderstood the decision. After 3 years of fighting, after countless appointments and humiliating evaluations and sleepless nights, the system had finally acknowledged what Marcus had known all along: his injury was real, significant, and connected to his military service. The letter detailed his disability rating and monthly benefit amount, figures that seemed almost impossibly generous after years of financial struggle. The monthly payments would cover their basic expenses with enough left over to begin rebuilding their savings. More importantly, the approval meant access to healthcare through the VA system, eliminating the crushing burden of medical bills that had contributed to their financial crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the letter included notification of retroactive payments dating back to when Marcus first filed his claim. The lump sum would be substantial enough to eliminate their debt and provide a cushion of security they had not enjoyed since his injury. For the first time in years, Marcus could envision a future that did not revolve around financial anxiety and bureaucratic warfare. But, even as relief flooded through him, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions that surprised him with their intensity. Joy at finally receiving recognition, certainly, but also anger at how long the process had taken and how much they had suffered unnecessarily. Gratitude for Robert Chen's expert advocacy, but also bitterness toward a system that required such advocacy to function properly. Pride in his persistence, but also grief for the dignity he had been forced to sacrifice along the way. Robert called within an hour of their receiving the letter, having been notified of the decision through official channels. His voice was warm with genuine pleasure at the outcome, but Marcus could hear the professional satisfaction of someone who had fought this battle many times before. For Robert, this was another successful case in his ongoing war against bureaucratic indifference. For Marcus, it was the difference between hope and despair. The conversation with Robert included practical details about when payments would begin and how to access his new healthcare benefits, but Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on the logistics. The emotional impact of finally being heard and validated was overwhelming, washing away 3 years of accumulated frustration and fear in a flood of vindication. After hanging up with Robert, Marcus and Sarah sat in their kitchen in relative silence, both processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The letter lay open on the table between them, a piece of paper that had just transformed their lives in ways they were still struggling to comprehend. The constant stress that had shadowed their marriage for years had suddenly lifted, replaced by possibilities they had almost forgotten how to imagine. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the cemetery where several of his former squad members were buried, men who had not survived their own wars against the system. He stood before their headstones and felt a complicated mixture of survivor's guilt and gratitude that his own battle had finally ended in victory. These men would never receive the recognition or care they deserved, but perhaps Marcus's success might somehow honor their memory and sacrifice. The transformation in their daily life was gradual but profound. The first VA healthcare appointment was a revelation in itself, being treated as a veteran deserving of care rather than a supplicant begging for mercy. The doctors were knowledgeable about military-related injuries and understood the unique challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian life. For the first time since his injury, Marcus felt like his needs were being taken seriously by medical professionals who understood his experience. The financial stability allowed Marcus to leave the night cleaning job and focus on finding more meaningful employment. Without the desperate need for immediate income, he could be selective about opportunities and seek positions that accommodated his physical limitations while utilizing his leadership experience. Several companies that had previously rejected his application suddenly seemed more interested when he was no longer desperate enough to accept any offer. Sarah was able to reduce her overtime hours and spend more time at home, allowing their relationship to begin healing from the stress that had strained it for so long. They began making plans for the future again, talking about vacations and home improvements and retirement savings, conversations that had been impossible during their years of financial crisis. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus's sense of self-worth and identity. The approval of his disability claim was more than financial relief, it was official recognition that his service had mattered and his sacrifice had been real. The system that had dismissed and humiliated him for years had finally acknowledged his worth as a veteran and as a person. Marcus began volunteering with Robert's organization, helping other veterans navigate the appeals process he had just completed successfully. His experience provided credibility with struggling veterans who were fighting their own battles against bureaucratic indifference. He could speak their language, understand their frustration, and offer hope based on his own eventual success. The volunteer work was therapeutic in ways Marcus had not anticipated. Helping other veterans gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing since his retirement from active duty. He was using his leadership skills again, mentoring younger veterans through challenges he understood intimately. The work reminded him that his experience, even the painful parts, had value and could be used to help others facing similar struggles. One particularly meaningful encounter involved a young Marine who had lost his leg to an improvised explosive device in Syria. The kid was angry and desperate, convinced that the system was rigged against him and that his case was hopeless. Marcus saw his former self in the young man's eyes and was able to offer both practical guidance and emotional support based on his own journey through the appeals process. Working with the Marine reminded Marcus of his former squad leader responsibilities, the way he had once mentored younger soldiers through the challenges of military service. The skills were transferable, and the need was just as urgent. Veterans who had successfully navigated the system had an obligation to help those still fighting, creating a network of mutual support that the official system too often failed to provide. 6 months after receiving his approval letter, Marcus attended a veterans event where he was introduced to Colonel James Patterson, his former brigade commander from Afghanistan. The colonel had retired from active duty and taken a position with a non-profit organization that supported veteran employment programs. Their conversation led to a job offer that seemed almost too good to be true. The position involved developing and managing programs that helped transitioning veterans find meaningful civilian employment. The work combined Marcus's military experience with his hard-earned understanding of veteran challenges, creating an opportunity that felt like a perfect fit for his skills and interests. The salary was competitive, the benefits were excellent, and the mission aligned with his own values and experiences. For the first time since his injury, Marcus felt like his career was moving forward rather than simply surviving. The new job provided not just financial security but also professional fulfillment and a sense that his experience could be used to help other veterans avoid some of the challenges he had faced. The work was demanding but meaningful, exactly the kind of purpose-driven employment he had been seeking for years. As he sat in his new office on his first day of work, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The past 4 years had been the most difficult of his life, testing him in ways that military service never had. He had been broken down and humiliated, forced to beg for recognition of sacrifices that should have been self-evident. But he had also discovered reserves of strength and persistence he had not known he possessed. Sarah had proven to be a partner of extraordinary loyalty and courage. Robert Chen had shown him that there were people in the system who genuinely cared about veteran welfare. The appeals board had ultimately demonstrated that justice was possible, even if it required extraordinary effort to achieve. The experience had changed him in fundamental ways. The confident young sergeant who had enlisted 25 years ago was gone, replaced by someone more vulnerable but, perhaps more human. The man who had survived combat and bureaucratic warfare understood now that true strength sometimes meant accepting help and that dignity could survive even the most humiliating circumstances. Marcus kept the approval letter in his desk drawer, not as a trophy but as a reminder of how far he had come and how many others were still fighting similar battles. Every veteran who walked into his office seeking help with employment or benefits would find someone who understood their struggles not from textbooks or training programs but from lived experience. The waiting was finally over. The recognition had come. The system had worked, eventually, imperfectly, but decisively. Marcus Thompson had found his place in the civilian world, not as a forgotten veteran but as a bridge between military service and civilian success. His war was over, but his mission to help other veterans win their own battles had just begun. In quiet moments, he still thought about that day in Afghanistan when the improvised explosive device had changed everything. The pain was still there, both physical and emotional, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become part of a larger story about sacrifice and recognition, about persistence and ultimate victory against systems designed to wear down the human spirit. The journey from that dusty road to his current position had been longer and more difficult than any military deployment he had ever undertaken. But, like those deployments, it had tested and revealed his character, demanding the best of his training and instincts. He had completed the mission, not just for himself but for Sarah and for all the veterans who would benefit from his hard-won understanding of how to fight and win against bureaucratic indifference. Staff Sergeant Thompson was gone, but Marcus had found something equally valuable, a sense of purpose that transcended rank or title, a mission that honored his service while creating meaning from his sacrifice. The waiting had ended not with simple victory but with transformation, not just with benefits received but with the opportunity to ensure that other veterans would not have to wait as long or fight as hard for the recognition they deserved. His story had become larger than his own experience, part of a continuing battle to honor those who serve by caring for them when their service is done.